Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink program. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. On this week's episode, we're taking things slow and delving into the effect that time has on some of our favourite dishes and ingredients. Coming up, we sit down with the head of fermentation at Zero Waste Restaurant Silo in London.
And you're basically harvesting those enzymes that the koji is secreting to then allow you to transform miso and soy sauce, basically the very difficult to digest soybeans. Also on the programme, we leave things to simmer as we explore the timeless appeal of soup. Plus, our in-house wine expert picks her well-aged wine of the month. All that here on The Menu on Monocle Radio. When we cook, we're used to thinking about the physical ingredients that we need to put on the shopping list or the flavour profiles that we need to combine in a dish. But one of the most important factors in making food taste good is actually something rather intangible: time. From slow cooking to aging, pickling to simmering, oftentimes leaving the produce to do its own thing results in the deepest and richest flavours. Fermentation is a process that you absolutely shouldn't rush. Ryan Walker knows this very well. As the head of fermentation for Zero Waste Restaurant Silo in London, he's at the helm of a new factory that looks a bit more like a science lab. There, he has been playing with rye, barley and soybeans, as well as many of the leftovers that come from the kitchen to achieve concentrated extracts that give the dishes on the menu ultimate umami. But the process is also making sure nothing goes wasted in the restaurant, and other businesses are getting involved too. I sat down with Ryan to find out more about the complex processes that turn ingredients into ferments and to take a peek into his flavour pantry. We were kind of content, in a way, with the work that we'd been doing around fermentation, for example, and how impactful it had been on the restaurant that was already zero waste. But since kind of tweaking it with the fermentation, we were like, okay, well, this is kind of revolutionary. Like it's taking, say, 70%, 80% of organic matter that was going in and out of the restaurant and allowing us to now utilise like 99%. So I think very late at night, we decided, why can't we apply this to a larger system? Why can't we apply this to like a borough or a town or even like the entirety of, say, East London, then London as a whole? So I think what we needed was scale, and we didn't really know how to achieve that. We already made a fair amount of koji at the restaurant in various different ways. So we thought, well, okay, we need a factory. We have all this space in Hackney Wick. Basically, things kind of started appearing out of the ether. And we just combined all of these things that were happening together, found a space, got everything in, then we started, basically. It wasn't as quick as that. I think there was a lot of talking and a lot of running around, and there was a lot of boots on the ground development for that process. But yeah, the long and the short of it was we felt like it was something that was necessary. We felt like it was something that was missing from the food system as a whole. And we kind of felt like it was the next step. We've always looked in, and still to this day, the way that we develop in the kitchen and develop in the restaurant is by observing first what we have as excess. But once you kind of achieved a system to combat that excess within your own, then we started looking, oh, these guys have loads of bread. These guys have spent grain. These guys have way better access to expensive seafood than we do, so they have all these amazing shells that we can use to make stocks and garums and so on and so forth. So I think we just started looking at other people as opposed to ourselves. And that's how it started.
Well, how important is fermentation for the restaurant? Because you've used the word necessity. Is it a necessity because you have the waste and you need to know what to do with the waste, and that is a process that helps you with the waste? Or how much are you actually interested in it from a kind of flavour inventiveness point of view?
Yeah, I think the fermentation is a true necessity in the sense that it ticks a lot of boxes that are true to not just a zero-waste food system, but a restaurant as a whole. One of the benefits of fermentation is, I guess, true flavour creation. What I mean by true flavour, it's creating the fundamental components of flavour. It's simple sugars, amino acids, so like your umami components. Like I grew up in Asia. I grew up using fish sauce and soy sauce and misos and all this stuff, and the food feels a lot fuller in terms of the complexity of it. European food has this beauty and art and
simplicity and elegance from it, but you do the analysis on a lot of these dishes that are popular, and it's all umami. It's just natural sources of umami, whereas in Asia, they've cultivated it. And this isn't always, like the Romans with garum and so on and so forth, and there's various British condiments like Worcestershire sauce and stuff. These are kind of ideas or products of cultivated umami. But what we decided was like, well, actually, we can make all these cultivated umami products with waste through fermentation. Same process soy sauce, same process as miso, same process as old Roman garum. And because of that, it's allowed us to create this base of the entire menu. So the foundation of every dish really is umami derived from waste through fermentation. So when it comes to the idea of closed-loop cooking, it's not just about like, oh, okay, we have an ingredient, we have a kind of primary cut, say, using like a meat analogy of an ingredient, and then we have excess, we have trim. It's kind of looking at the ingredient and its constituents as different components of something, and then taking, or I guess transforming those characteristics of an ingredient into flavour through, again, this fermentation process. And that forms the entire menu. So it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship through waste. It gets to the point where, like, we wish, in a way, we had more specific waste streams.
Waste.
More excess. Because, and this is kind of what tied into the fermentation factory in a way, where we're like, oh, well, actually, we can take other people's waste streams and transform that and use it on our menu as flavours, and then the rest, it can go back to theirs. But yeah, so it's very much fundamental and very much necessary to building delicious dishes. I mean, part of my job is developing the menu and creating these dishes, and it makes my job a hell of a lot easier having such an umami pantry, an umami surplus to utilise, and in a way that makes sense. Like, we also do this in quite large scale, even within the restaurant, so that we can run a dish with these ferments for as long as that dish is on, as long as the season lasts. And then when the season's over, we still have some left, and we can use those for next dishes and so on and so forth.
I was very surprised when I came to the fermentation factory because I didn't really know what to expect. And I suppose a lot of us think of ferments like kimchi or cabbage, or we have different things in mind. And I was quite surprised when the tasting actually consisted of a lot of pipettes and a lot of liquids, that very, very potently flavoured liquids that you kind of had us try. Well, what led you towards this kind of product, which you kind of broadly tend to call kind of koji or garum? What is koji? What is garum? And why did you choose to go in this direction with this kind of fermentation experiment?
Koji is, I guess at its most simple, is a fungus that you grow on starch. So traditionally in Japan, it's grown on rice, barley, and soybeans. But it is essentially the scientific definition is a filamentous fungi. Think mycelium, think mushrooms. You're basically using grains or legumes as a substrate to cultivate this fungus. I mean, now, why are we growing a fungus on grains is probably the thought. I guess what you're essentially doing is growing enzymes. And I used to think that was a very complicated way of explaining it, but I genuinely think that's the most simple, but more specifically digestive enzymes. So the way that koji eats is by something called extracellular digestion. As humans, we digest everything inside of our bodies. We have these enzymes naturally in our mouth, in our gut, digestive tract, so on and so forth. Very similar actually to like other animals and fish. Koji spits out enzymes onto something that it's trying to dissolve to then eventually feed off of it. And you're basically harvesting those enzymes that the koji is secreting to then allow you to transform, miso and soy sauce, like basically the very difficult to digest soybeans. Soybeans are like 50% protein. They're a wonder food, technically. But if you just try to eat dried soybeans, like cooked, you can have a pretty bad time on the old digestive system. What the koji does in these processes is basically eat the food for you. And instead of and it turns those things into its core components, which is your kind of sugars and amino acids, which is basically what your body is doing for food anyway, just before. We call it pre-digestion, basically. A lot of fermentation is pre-digestion, or the other one is unlocking what we call bioactive compounds. So it's not... Fermentation can do one of two things, basically. It can either create things, what we call de novo, which is you have, say, lactic ferment, like kimchi. The bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, will eat the sugars and turn it into lactic acid. That's creating lactic acid. What koji does is it takes something like a soybean and it unlocks the amino acids inside. So it's already in there. It's just making it more bioavailable for humans. This happens in like kombucha as well. The microbes in the kombucha don't create antioxidants. They take the antioxidants that are locked in the tea leaves and they unlock it for humans to consume.
It sounds very scientific, but I know for a fact from people who are trying to make kombucha at home, or even just coming to the fermentation factory myself, that it's actually quite unpredictable as well. Like, yes. There is a very slippery element to all of this. And I wanted to ask you, when it comes to fermentation, there are all these chains and all these scientific aspects to it, but how important are other ingredients to it, such as time? Like, there were some kojis that we tried where you said, oh, this last week tasted completely different, and now it's just taken a complete turn. I had no idea this would happen, and yet here we are. So how important is time an ingredient in this process?
So, the flavour of time is what we refer to fermentation as. So I'd argue it affects every form of fermentation. So the one that we're most common with is what's called wild fermentation. It's using microorganisms and maybe even enzymes that are naturally found within the air, within skins of vegetables, within the very environment that we exist in. Even our own microorganisms can have some impact in this like dance, I guess, of microbes. And because these reactions that take place over time, and they can happen in short amounts of time, and they can happen in long amounts of time. I guess the flavour of age, which is what people like in terms of wine and these type of ferments, it's a tricky one. People say, like, if you age wine longer, it's better. That's not true with all wines. It's just, I think the best way to put it is, because taste is subjective, maybe not so much with the umami, but in general it's subjective. For example, in Japan, no one wants to age sake. But now in the West, what they're doing is they're importing lots of aged sake for a pretty premium price. I remember when I was there last, you could get a bottle that's been aged for 40, 50 years, and it was like £20. You have a similar whiskey, for example, you're looking at maybe close to £7,000, £8,000. And that doesn't necessarily mean that whiskey is better. It just means it's different. However, I mean, with some fermentations, I'd say the flavour of time is definitely better. I always came from like kind of a purist approach to these specific fermentations where I was like, okay, they have to be aged for 6 months or they have to be aged for a year. Something we've tried in the restaurant recently is doing lower salt and a faster ferment. And they create what we consider a younger flavour. And you can really taste that. It's brighter, it's a bit more acidic, it's a tiny bit saltier. There's a taste of immaturity to them, but they're fun. It really reflects kind of, I don't know, humans in a way. It's like, you can be older and wiser and more mature, but at the other end, you can be younger and I don't know, more fun. But that's not, again, like humans, it's not linear. It's not guaranteed. Like, it's not like that will happen and that will happen.
It strikes me as so strange that you need to have so much patience, really, because some of these things you have to wait 1, 2, 3, 4 years to be able to use in their best possible expression. But then also you're running a restaurant, which, as we all know, is just like a hectic place to be, and the speed of service and the speed of having to reinvent the menu constantly. How does that marry up with these two very different time frames? One that's moving at kind of snail's pace and the other one that's just constantly revolving.
Yeah, there's its challenges for sure, but it's not as difficult as we thought. The benefit of having, it is difficult in London, not so much for the fermentation processes or any of this, it's actually space. So we have we have a big cupboard, and at one point we had like 1.5 tons of ferments bubbling away in that back cupboard. But that's one, it's interesting for us because it's a snapshot of the would-be waste of the restaurant. But it also acts as it's a memory bank of also previous flavours, but it's also just enough scale to get through the restaurant, and we're constantly updating it. I mean, if you think about what you're trying to achieve at a fine dining restaurant, it's building flavour, it's championing local ingredients, it's making a difference, it's being something different to just a run-of-the-mill restaurant. And the fermentation allows us to do that.
That was Ryan Walker speaking to me at Midori House. This is the menu. Next, we arm ourselves with a wooden spoon and patience to delve into the soothing art of making soup. For many in the Northern Hemisphere, January feels like the slowest month of the year, so it seems fitting not to rush the way we make our food either. Spending time stirring a pot by the stove can warm the spirit as well as the belly. Contributor Angelica Jopson has spent the past month making dozens of her own soups, and here she writes an ode to this staple that might seem simple, but actually can take so many forms and flavours and has plenty of stories to tell if only you take the time.
January is a jolt. As the calendar rolls around into a new year, culinary convention suggests we part ways with all that we can lusciously dollop and deliciously drizzle onto our plates, that which we can pile high and tuck into with abandon. In its place for the first month of the year, custom says, perhaps something more austere. And while I agree that for everything there is a season, January for us in the Northern Hemisphere with its long dark days and icy temperatures is the least compatible with the curtailing of sensory pleasures. Just because the festivities have ended, there is no need to dabble in the flavourless and to eat without occasion. So come and stand with me over the simmering pot in my kitchen and breathe in the aromas as I tell you why this is the month for celebrating one of civilization's oldest sustenance. The soup. After weeks of going, quite frankly, mad about cooking and ordering and tasting every sort I could get my hands on, I remain an advocate, passionately waving my ladle in the air. Soup, as I've discovered, is not a last resort or just an easy option, something to rustle together with whatever is on hand, though it does fit these roles well. It's an adventure in itself, a process, a delectable restoration for the soul, and a point of cultural and historic connection. The slower cooked, the better. It's an endeavour that rewards patience and curiosity and has a special relationship with time. Not just the time spent letting ingredients meld together over a low heat, but also the time taken in sharing recipes with others, and the passage of time passing recipes down through the generations. In quick succession, my pot has seen a rotation of soups, including tomatoey Tuscan riboletas, lemony Greek avgelomonos, and warming Vietnamese pho. With each comes an origin, strong opinions of traditional methods, and the best version from any person or source you consult. To my own ends, each also comes with a house full of fragrance and spoonfuls of alchemy. As award-winning food writer Ella Risbridger says, a good soup should always be more than the sum of its parts. Now, soup in January is no novelty. In 1983, Campbell's, the American canned food giant, declared it National Soup Month to sell more stock to consumers. The company, founded over 150 years ago, has long been known for its innovative marketing. Adverts like this one from 1953 literally sing the praises of its offerings.
Did someone say soup? Soup and a salad, delicious. Soup and a sandwich is great. Soup for lunch is nutritious. Yes, you are my favorite date.
Despite its commercial origins, January as the month of the soup has endured and is still listed on culinary calendars, inspiring people, including me, to reach for their pots. Because there is, of course, much more to soup than what it says on the tin. Archaeologists believe that the first soup may have been cooked up as far back as 20,000 years ago, long before the advent of agriculture. Pottery fragments from a large bowl in Jiandong Cave in China suggest our ancestors started boiling food to extract more nutrition. Cooking with oil came later, which leads researchers to think this pot was used more like a cauldron. We can only guess at their early recipes, but fast forward to 4,000 years ago and to the clay tablets that are still preserved in Yale University's Babylonian collection. They contain ancient recipes, including for soup, which have been decoded by a team of food historians and chemists. Take this recipe for bashrutum, a soup you might serve to someone with a cold. It's a broth with leek, coriander, and onion, and its name translates as unwinding. It seems our Mesopotamian foremothers and fathers already understood that soup simply makes us feel better. While I've tucked into bisques and broths and chowders, and one recipe that called for 44 cloves of garlic, there's no way that my month of soup would have been complete without the ubiquitous chicken soup. For me, this is one that needs no recipe and should be guided only by a combination of whoever made it for you first and whoever made it for you best. To me, it tastes of bay leaves and peppercorns and needs to be topped with handfuls of fresh herbs, parsley, dill, or both. Whether chicken soup is medicinal or not was the subject of a 1993 peer-reviewed study by the University of Nebraska Medical Center. The full study, republished in 2020, is one of my favorite documents to read, as it's surely one of a very small number of academic papers to include a recipe for grandma's soup. Its results? Yes. According to concentration, it inhibits neutrophil migration. Basically, it's mildly anti-inflammatory, and the exact recipe doesn't matter much. In fact, the restorative property of soup is the reason we have the word restaurant. Soups, known as restauratives, were sold by street vendors in 18th century France. The tale goes that a man named Boulanger opened a restaurant in Paris in 1706, selling his concoctions in a more permanent location, and then slowly expanding his menu. While most restaurants offer soup as a starter or a light bite, there are others who make it the main event. Watana Panish in Bangkok famously serves a beef and goat soup that's been boiling for nearly 50 years.
This train terminates.
Closer to home here in London, there's one restaurant soup that astounded me, not because of its complexity, though it holds up as being better than the sum of its parts, but because I didn't think it was real. Kipfel is a small Austrian cafe in a pretty alleyway in Islington. On the menu is Frittatensuppe, hearty beef broth with strips of savoury pancake. Now, I'd seen this combination before. My German grandfather, a long-time resident of Johannesburg, would inexplicably cut up leftover pancakes and stir them into a mug of stock granules for a snack. Odd, I thought, but perhaps it was just his thing. But he clears up for me that no, this dish of childhood nostalgia is not his own invention, and that I'd only come across it is really the more surprising part. It really is quite famous. In southern Germany, it's called Flerdlesuppe, but the building blocks are the same. At Kipfel, the broth bursts with flavour and soaks through the porous pancakes. Like my favourite January discoveries, it's what a soup should be. Something made with care and time. Something surprising that comes with a history and a connection. Either your own or an insight into others. And something that warms the belly and the heart.
Thanks, Angelica. This is the menu. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Maisie Ringer.
Staff in the KFC outlet at Shenyang Taoshan International Airport in China say they brace themselves for a busy service every time a flight is due to take off for North Korea's capital, Pyongyang. The North Korean passengers heading home dashed to the fast food outlet before boarding, eager to stock up on exclusive menu items such as hamburgers. Fast food items are often taken home as souvenirs. The mere 1-hour flight means the burgers can be eaten by friends and family waiting in arrivals whilst they're still warm. Inditex, the global textile giant, has set a benchmark for sustainability with its innovative company canteens. The office restaurants prioritise local sourcing, sustainability and waste reduction. 85% of their food comes from local Galician suppliers, with a focus on zero-kilometre produce and organic products. The approach has led to significant cost savings and environmental benefits, such as a reduction in packaging, transport costs and CO2 emissions. The return of perennial British singleton Bridget Jones to cinema screens this month is inspiring fans to try their hands at dishes featured in her movies. Local supermarket Waitrose says that compared with this time last year, recipe searches for leek and potato soup were up 233%, while searches for orange marmalade were up 553%, with sales of the products themselves also on the rise. Further data shows that shoppers are also being inspired by Jones's notorious penchant for Chardonnay, with sales of the citrusy white also rising in recent weeks. Those are the week's food and drink headlines. Now back to Kiara.
Thanks, Maisie. You're listening to The Menu. And finally, on today's show, we're once again joined by our wine expert, Chloé Lake. She was tasked with something very specific, finding a wine that exemplifies the importance of aging in a bottle. She picked Chateau de Zanero Lalande de Pomerol. Chloé, I'm so happy to have you here today because I feel like we're tackling what's actually a huge subject in the world of wine.
Absolutely.
Because, you can talk about grapes, you can talk about terroir, but what about time? It's one of the most important ingredients actually in making a wine, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a subject of massive contention as well. You have people that believe they only want aged wine, and there's some people who believe wines are better drank young. But in truth, both types of people are right. You can have aged wines or you can have young wines, and they both have pros and cons. But today we'll be tasting a slightly older wine. And I thought we could maybe start by kind of debunking that myth that old wines are the best. Not all wines improve for age. In fact, most of them are designed to be drunk young. If you think of a Gamay from Beaujolais, that is best drunk young every year. And some wines have very strong primary aromas. So if you think of a young Sauvignon Blanc, that smells so much of grassiness, so much freshness. And some people really like that and want to preserve that. But when you age wine, the kind of tertiary aroma, so that's the things that you only get from the oxygen coming into the bottle, are what really start to stand out. And in red wine in particular, you get kind of leather, you get maybe a bit more earthy senses like mushroom, and people like to say leaves, but I kind of just say earthy. So yeah, it really depends on your tastes, but aging wine, it depends on the grape and all sorts of things.
Well, and can you also age a wine too much? Because I remember visiting some cellars sometimes and seeing some pretty dusty specimens up on the shelves and being like, I mean, is that maybe taking it a bit too far?
Yeah.
How far is too far?
Again, that depends completely on the grape. I mean, you can age wines there have been tales of wines that have aged for hundreds of years and people have drank them and they're like, wow, this is still really great. But some wines go off after about 5 years. Yeah, it depends on the initial strength of the grape, that flavor intensity that it has, and also its kind of natural preservative qualities. So the tannins, the acidity, both of those two things tend to mellow with age. So if you have a grape that has high quantities at the start, that will usually help it in the long run.
But yeah, what about the wines that truly do hit their mark when they're truly really well aged? There are some wines that cost an actual fortune.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have some, excitingly, in a decanter in front of us. So
yes,
I'm not able to tell what vintage we're going to have today. So I'm going to have to guess that you brought in probably something that cost in the region of thousands of pounds. No, I'm joking. But, I think
that would be cool.
It's remarkable that when we're talking about aging, we really can go up in the regions of the decades, and also that wines do get extraordinarily expensive in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's classic Romani Conti. You can spend thousands on a bottle of that. But you can also find some great deals, I mean, for not too expensive. Today's wine, for example, is probably coming sort of to the end of its aging period, but it's definitely a steal from Bordeaux. You can find these sorts of good things if you look around. So,
well, what kind of wine actually benefits from being drunk later rather than sooner? So we've talked about debunking the myth, but there is also some truth to the myth, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'd say both are right, and it depends on the grape entirely. So what we're tasting today is a mixture of Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. Those are the types of grapes that age really well because they're normally higher in those acidity and tannins. And that's kind of what you need in order for a wine to age. The ones that have less of that, and sometimes, in a white wine, you want to preserve maybe more of its fruit-forward notes. In that case, you wouldn't age it. But if you want something that maybe will go well with meat or that will kind of give you more of a leathery flavor, then absolutely, you age that. But depends completely on the grape.
And what about countries and regions? I feel like so frequently when we're thinking about the great wines of the world. It's the French wines that you imagine kind of sitting there in the cellars for decades and decades. Maybe, you know, some fortified wines of Portugal, but what's your experience in terms of where there is the long established tradition of really, really going for aging the wines?
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the word tradition, because that is often what it comes down to. But if you're looking for aged wine, I think you can go anywhere in the world that has the right characteristics. So that could be Argentina, could be Australia, could well be France or Italy, any of the classic places. I've gone to France today, but anywhere is capable of producing it. And I think these days that's coming to the fore a lot more, and people are recognizing different places other than the classic winemaking countries. So.
Well, tell us about this specific wine then. I can't see the label because you have decanted it.
I have decanted it. It's been sitting around for about 20 minutes, so I'm hoping it's opened up a little bit. It's from France. It's from the Bordeaux region. So the family that's been producing it has been doing it for, I think, about 500 years, so a really long time. And this is actually from 2007, so we're nearing 20 years, kind of coming to the end of its aging process. But as I said, it's a mix of Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot. I think predominantly Merlot. It's from the right bank in Bordeaux, and what you'd expect from that is more Merlot heavy wines. And the reason it's mixed with Cabernet Sauvignon is because they balance each other out. So Cabernet Sauvignon is normally higher in tannins, acidity, and Merlot kind of brings that down, and it adds more of a base fruitier flavor, which will help it in the long run as well with aging. So it should be a good candidate.
Well, shall we give it a taste? And then I'd like to ask you also, what would have happened if we drank this wine 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Would it have been a completely different wine?
Yeah, I mean, we can totally expect it to change kind of depending on when we drink it. If we drank this when it came out, I would expect it to be perhaps a lot heavier, a lot more tannic. I think what we'll taste today will be something much meatier, more savory, less fruit forward, and not as tannic, I think. So it should be quite smooth. Maybe still acidic, but smoother.
Okay, well, shall we test that in reality?
Let's try it.
Please, you do the honors. Okay, so what are we thinking on the nose?
Wow, it's very intense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily always one for paying as much attention to the nose as I do to the mouthfeel, but you can't avoid this.
It's very strong. I'm getting a lot of sort of candied fruit flavor, but I don't expect that we'll taste that. I think it will taste very savory when it comes to drinking.
Yeah, I went ahead and did it. Sorry, I cut to the chase. But I mean, it's probably because you planted the idea in my head, but I really do find a lot of that kind of leatheriness in it. Is that true?
No, definitely. And especially with Cabernet Sauvignon, it's one of the kind of characteristics that you will expect to come out of it. That and maybe more of a cigar smoky kind of taste as well.
It always just feels so sort of gentleman's clubby describing these wines, right? There's this whole world of kind of rarefied old schoolness to them.
No, I agree. And something about the kind of aftertaste as well is very meaty. I can see myself sitting down with a steak and a cheese board eating this.
But I feel like you'd almost just want to drink it by itself because it's so peculiar.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever actually even had dinner with a wine that was so characterful before.
Yeah, it's certainly got a lot of expression and very, very soft as well. The tannins have really reduced, I think, with age, which is nice. The acidity is still there, but it's kind of a smooth, very intense flavor.
Okay, well, I love that we waited patiently to try this wine. But let's not leave it that long. Let's just see you in a month, Chloé, shall we?
See you then. Cheers.
Thanks, Chloé. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's at midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show Food Neighborhoods for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This program was produced by Monica Lillis and our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. Thanks for listening, and until next week.